Welcome everyone to the JACR special issue workshop on addiction and maladaptive consumption. My name is Martin Reimann. I'm an associate professor of marketing at the University of Arizona. I'd also like to give my co-editor, Shelley Jane, an opportunity to present himself.
Yeah, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you're in. Thank you very, very much for joining. So wonderful to see you all, and thank you for your wonderful scholarship, which Martin and I had the honor of, working into this issue. So I'm the James D. Curry Professor of Marketing and International Business at University of Washington at Foster School of Business. And I have developed this interest in addiction and maladaptive consumption over the past 7 or 8 years. And it has been a real challenge, but a real joy to dig into this area, which is really, really badly needed for the well-being of our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. All right, so the bigger picture of the special issue is that unfortunately addiction, maladaptive consumption have been on the rise, and we'd like to address this, and you have addressed this in your wonderful submissions. And the goal and objective is to combat addiction, maladaptive consumption from the perspective of consumer research, but also the perspective of psychology, medicine, and neuroscience. We have two conceptual papers that bring in that perspective as well. As for definitions, well, maladaptive consumer behavior has been said or defined as a state or trait that is rather harmful than helpful. As for addiction, the Association for Psychiatric Research, Diagnostics and Statistical Manual defines addiction as substance-related disorders, such as tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, and also gambling and gaming-related disorders that have one commonality: producing intense activation of the brain's reward system. What is interesting that latest version of the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders from 2013 does not yet include other behavioral addictions, such as shopping addictions, sex addictions, smartphone and internet addictions, and the like. And we're very happy that in this special issue we can push the frontier in that regard and include papers that empirically investigate those. As for the mechanisms and processes that have been discussed in this special issue, we're happy to view maladaptive consumption from neurophysiological viewpoints, a paper by Terrell and Basharo, and then papers by Clitheroe, Karmakar, and Zhu, and also psychological explanations for maladaptive consumption by Rifkin and Berger and Vogel and Pechman. And we have wonderful papers in substantive areas, classical substantive areas that have been subject to research for many years in alcohol and tobacco, and we're very happy to have new insights on those, and then also gambling and financial risk seeking. And then, as I mentioned, pushing the frontier, we're looking also in this special issue at behavioral addictions related to sex, materialism, and overabundance of possessions, including clutter, and then addictions related to the usage of internet, social media, and smartphones. So we're very happy to have a very nice collection of empirical work in this area. So for today's presentations, we go in the following order. These papers will be featured in the special issue, and we encourage the audience to familiarize themselves with those papers. So I'd like to ask first Ophir Terrell to share your screen if you can.
So I'm the lucky one to go first. So thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. It's very nice to meet you all. I've seen your name on all sorts of papers, but it's nice to put, a face to the name or name to the face in your case. So I'm a professor of information systems and decision sciences at Cal State Fullerton, and also a scholar in residence at the University of Southern California. This is all temporary because as of depending on travel restrictions, I'm going to be moving to the University of Melbourne. So there is someone mentioned that there is someone from New Zealand down here. Oh yeah, Patrick, I'm going to join you in the Down Under soon, if they open the airports. But anyhow, so I've been working in the last 10 years or so on issues such as social media addiction and video gaming addiction. And as Martin mentioned, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders does not include these sort of addictions as formal disorders. However, they do include in Section 3 something called Internet Gaming Disorder, which Section 3 is the section that lists potential mental disorders. And therefore, it means that they sort of started paying attention to this issue and recognized that people could become addicted to behaviors that are not necessarily involve substances and neurotoxicity in the brain, which is a good sign, which means that potentially in the future, I guess consumption addiction or maladaptive consumption could become a serious issue that should be and can be treated. So our work in this particular paper relies on prior works that I did with Antoine Bechara on the process of developing addictions and sustaining addictions. And this process, coming from a substance use standpoint and gambling standpoint, involves three brain systems. All of them were mentioned independently in prior marketing research. So the reward system is a classic example where you could look at, going back to papers by Baba Shiv on the wine experiment that he has done. So all of these systems have been there, but they were not integrated into a coherent model that can explain the formation and sustenance of addiction or maladaptive consumption. So these three systems are the traditional systems. Let me start with that. Include the reward system that creates temptation to engage in consumption. The self-control system, for those of you who read Kahneman, the works of Danny Kahneman, also known as, I actually switched them in the slide. It could be, it should be system 1 and 2. But we have a self-control system that is supposed to restrain or inhibit tempting behaviors that may harm us in the long run. And what's interesting about the new conceptualization is the third system, that this is something that Antoine Bechara has discovered more from a neurological standpoint. The system is an interoceptive awareness system that creates a sense of or signals that something is wrong and stimulates urge or craving to consume whatever we're missing. So when we're hungry, this system is activated. When we are deprived of sleep, it is activated. When we are deprived of whatever we want to consume, it is activated. And the activation of the system has been coupled positively with the reward system. So it exacerbates or accentuates the activation of the reward system, and it hijacks or preoccupies the self-control system. Think about, I'm going to use a pretty gross example here. When you need to urinate, for example, it takes over your prefrontal cortex and makes it difficult for you to inhibit other thoughts or behaviors. So this is exactly what the system does. It messes up the balance between the reward system and the inhibition self-control system. So why can it be relevant for the case of maladaptive consumption? Well, the basic logic is that in the brain, a reward is a reward. It doesn't matter if it comes from using cocaine, sex, eating chocolate, or consuming something. So once we understand that, we could understand that repetition of rewards, repetitive consumption, and by the way, when I say consumption, it doesn't have to be physical products. It could be consuming information on Facebook. When we repeat this process, we sensitize our system 1, our reward system, and we weaken. Some of us have, I guess it's a combination of nature and nurture. It could be genetic and so on, but some of us have more sensitive system one to begin with, and some of us also have weaker abilities to self-control our behaviors. And this imbalance leads to maladaptive consumption, and it is exacerbated by the interoceptive awareness system, which is sort of the new edge of understanding maladaptive behaviors, the insular cortex dependent system. So that's pretty much what I have to say about it. I think the key idea is to keep in mind is we have three systems that are borrowed from the addiction literature, the substance addiction literature. We have shown that they work in tandem in the case of food consumption, in the case of video gaming, for example. There is no reason to believe that they wouldn't work in consumption of other products, in the case of consumption of other products, and they can serve as a good starting point or a model that can explain why some people develop maladaptive consumption.
Thank you, Ofer. Fabulous. Very, very nice. Thank you so much. So we will have next, John. You want to take it away? Thank you, Ofer, again.
I need to stop sharing.
Hey, everybody. It's nice to meet a lot of you. I've met a few of you in person before, but it's nice to meet the rest of you. So thank you to Martin and Shelley, of course, for putting together this special issue. I got really excited when I saw the call for it. I 100% agree that we need to see more content like this. So it's great to see this topic getting the attention, and I'm eager to read the rest of these papers. So this is a conceptual paper that I wrote with my friends and colleagues, Uma, who's at Rady, and Ming, who's at Haas. And let me just walk you through very briefly what we're trying to accomplish with our paper. So the idea, when you read the consumer research literature out there, it's actually pretty wonderful. There's all this great work in the 80s and 90s, a lot of interviews with people who report to be addicts in various ways. And so there's a lot of literature out there in the consumer world already that I think if you go and read it, they talk about a lot of things in depth, like compulsive consumption, how that relates to OCD, some other various disorders. And so we were reading some of these papers, and it was pretty exciting because the topics that they were talking about reminded us of a lot of literature that's out there in neuroeconomics and psychiatry. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of the kinds of questions that these fields are seeking to answer. And so we thought there would be a lot of room to unify, bring together some of these concepts in ways that would be exciting, and hopefully, ask some new questions for consumer research. And so what we do in the paper is we zoom in on kind of two domains where we think there's particularly a lot of room for collaboration. And the first one, Ofer got into some of this with the first talk, is that there's been a lot of work done understanding just how the brain executes decisions that we as marketers care about. Not necessarily in the maladaptive domain, but in all domains. There's been a lot of progress in that. One broad area that we talk about in the paper is in the domain of reinforcement learning. So we're all very familiar with the goals literature and the habits literature. And neuroeconomics has been fascinated in studying this for a long time as well. And so there's some frameworks that port very well, I think, from that domain over into the way that consumer behavior researchers think about things. So we talk about that, and I'll give an example of that in a second. And then the other one, and actually when you read some of these compulsive consumption papers, they actually get into this as well. So the psychiatry world talks about comorbidities a lot of times, and they usually frame it as a challenge for the field, in the sense that the diagnoses are somewhat limited if you have all of these individuals who have multiple diagnoses, basically like multiple different clinical disorders, like say anxiety, depression, addiction. If you have multiple diagnoses, then these things are comorbid. We try and flip that around and think of that as a point of where we can make some headway and think about a deeper understanding of some of these maladaptive behaviors that marketers are talking about. So those are kind of the two things that we unpack in the paper. Just to kind of walk you through a couple of the frameworks that we touch on, that I think it's nice to think about them as being connected, actually. So this cycle of addiction, these are not things that are novel to us. They've been studied for decades. But we talk about them in the paper a little bit. We'd be very familiar with these three steps. when you're talking about being preoccupied, anticipating whatever kind of consumption it is. It could be a drug, could be shopping, all these different kinds of things. Then there's the binging phase, and then we're all familiar with like the feeling of affect, negative affect, and potentially withdrawal, and how these can reinforce each other. So this is one way that it's thought about. What we talk about more in the paper, and it's nice to think about how impulsivity is often, I think, the word that you hear even more so, but compulsive consumption has a very distinct meaning, and the transition from kind of more goal-directed behavior to more habitual control has a very kind of long-studied transition, and so the paper unpacks that a little bit as well. I think the other thing that I like to say, okay, so I'll show you one brain figure just to kind of drive home the point that I think it's important to realize that a lot of these brain regions, so if we were talking about everyday consumption, like what kind of food do I like, how much do I want to pay for something, and then we switch over to talking about maladaptive consumption, there's a lot of overlap in these brain regions. So all of the work that's been done to understand how healthy brains make decisions can inform us for when we're talking about how more unhealthy decisions are made. And this reinforcement learning framework also utilizes the same brain regions, and Ofer touched on this as well. So I think this is just something that we wanted to make sure was kind of clear in the paper, that there's a lot of overlap between understanding how healthy decisions, normal everyday decisions are made, and how these, quote, maladaptive behaviors are made. And then I'll just conclude. I have this one analogy. This is not my analogy, but I really like it when I've read some clinical work, that if you think about when a light bulb goes out, why does a light bulb go out? Is it because the bulb is dead? Is it because the lamp that it's plugged into is problematic, or is the switch, faulty? So there's many different kind of levels of sources of where the ultimate behavior, which in this case is the light bulb going out, that you're observing is problematic. And so I think it's nice to think that there are these other levels, through the brain that we can study at to kind of understand what's the common problem that might be leading to a bunch of distinct, say, light bulbs going out. So that's the conceptual contribution, hopefully. Looking forward to hearing everybody else talk. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Connie, thank you very much. Thank you, Connie.
So I'm Connie Peschman from the University of California, Irvine, and I worked on this with Aaron Vogel at Stanford University in the medical school. And the background is that for about 10 years, a team of us have been working to create self-help groups using social media that would help people combat various addictions. And I've worked closely with NIH, and they asked me to start with tobacco, which was frankly great because that's my area of expertise. But they would love to create these groups and then be able to use them for other maladaptive behaviors like cocaine or whatever, or alcoholism. And the idea being that you could get a small group of people together that form a cohesive team and help each other combat their addictions. So we called it, we got a big grant and we had artists involved, and we called it Tweet to Quit. And we've run 2 big trials, and overall we've gotten better, but it's really, really hard to get these groups to work. And in fact, we've made more progress than most groups who have given up because I don't know what's wrong, but I just think it's extremely hard to get people to combat addictions. And there is no healthcare provider in these groups, so it's just peer-to-peer. So the biggest problem is that people don't necessarily stick with the group or get what they want out of the group. So if you could go to the next slide, what we're trying to do in this project was to figure out if there are automated ways of helping the people in the group. So basically putting in a chat bot that would interact with the groups. There are about 20 people in each group. That seems to be a really good number. Some groups work great, some aren't as good. And the idea would be that a chat bot could come in and help out either the whole group or individuals. by reacting to their posts. So you get an idea, we have about 1,500 posts per group. So they are very active, and they post technically for 90 days, but the groups are most active in the first 30 days when they have the most symptoms of withdrawal. They all get nicotine patches and gum to help them with quitting because they need that pharmacological help also. But even with all of that, we're feeling like we need an automated chatbot to help out. And so the idea of this project was to see if there was a software that could automatically read the posts and extract content and provide useful information back to us as to what the chatbot should say. So what we used was this software called LAWC, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which is a terrible name. But basically, it reads it extracts information from the posts. So what we did was we wanted to focus on emotions because it seemed that was the crux of the problem, that people are feeling negative emotions and we're not able to respond to them because there's no human watching this, because having a human involved makes it prohibitively expensive. So the chat box could respond. But to begin with, we needed to see whether it even works. So what we did is we used this software that's heavily used at UCI, and probably you might be aware of it. Ask it to find the emotionally laden words in each person's string of posts and see if it related to abstinence. Because if the software can't even detect posts that relate to abstinence, then it's not going to be very helpful to us going forward. So what we found was we had emotional expressed in 58,000 of these posts. There was a total of 36 groups we looked at, 606 people that were active, and overall 41% were abstinent at month end, which is actually standard for many very high intense interventions like ours. The problem is keeping them abstinent for 3 months and 6 months. That's the problem. So anyway, but 60% were not abstinent, even despite having the group and all this help and expressing a desperate need to quit. Anyway, what we found was that there were much more, this doesn't have the most, the prevalence of overall positive emotions. Okay, so these percentages, so when you see under the column of prevalence, those are the percentage of posts that have positive comments or negative comments and then specific negative comments. And as an aside, this software cannot apparently distinguish between different specific positive emotions, only some specific negative ones, which I think is interesting. So you could see that overall positive emotions dominated negative. About 8% of posts were positive and about 2% were negative. And interestingly, positive posts, despite being prevalent, did not predict abstinence. So that p-value of 0.65 shows there was no prediction with abstinence. What did predict abstinence was overall negative emotions, which was just 2% of the posts. So that was negatively related to abstinence, lowered abstinence, and especially anxiety was related to not quitting. And then the tone is a different measure. It's 50 is average, so it's like a compilation versus a baseline. And our overall tone was 54, so basically about average based on posts in general and social media and on Twitter. And that also related to abstinence. So otherwise, having a more upbeat rather than a downbeat emotional tone. So what positive emotions in and of themselves didn't predict abstinence, but the ratio of positive to negative did. So the more people were positive relative to negative, the more likely they were to quit. So what this tells us is that it is possible to run this software in the background. As a first step, at least there's some possibility to run the software in the background, figure out who is expressing especially anxiety as a negative emotion and or overall negative emotion, and then having the chat bot come in and try to intervene and talk to that person within the group to try to, I don't know exactly what, that'd be the next step, but try to use existing literature to tell us what to tell the person to help them cope with their anxiety, to help improve abstinence. So that's it.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you very much.
All right. So our paper is When Does Intoxication Help or Hurt My Case? This is joint work that I've done with Kelly Goldsmith at Vanderbilt and also Hal Hirschfield at UCLA. And what motivated this research was really this paradox where oftentimes, especially us who work at universities, we see this all the time, people have this tendency to discount their subsequent maladaptive behavior when that behavior was done while they're intoxicated. So, oh, well, I did that just because I was drunk, right? I wouldn't actually do it otherwise. But also people simultaneously have this belief that in vino veritas, or we're more like ourselves when we're disinhibited while intoxicated. And so really this research started with this question of how, when, and why do we judge others differently for their maladaptive behaviors when those maladaptive behaviors are conducted under the influence. And kind of like Connie, we first started thinking about emotions or the nature of the crime and how the nature of the crime might influence how people judge the behavior when the person is under the influence. And with some studies and some pre-tests, we found that people had this lay belief that alcohol disinhibits our ability to engage in emotional regulation or exert emotional control over our actions. And so we hypothesized that for actions with this emotional component or this emotional motive, alcohol would serve to discount that behavior. That if the perpetrator was drunk at the time, then other people, when judging that person and their actions, would be a little bit more lenient on that person. However, when the crime is not emotional in nature, we hypothesized that intoxication would have no effect on that behavior. And we tested this in two different ways. We looked at actual criminal sentencing data, and we also had a lab experiment where we could exert a little bit more control over other things, like, for example, the nature of the actual crime itself. And across both of these things, we found that when the action was emotionally motivated or had some feasible emotional motivation, then consistently, both judges and lay consumers reduced the harshness of their judgments about the person. And what this ultimately led to was actually reduction in the punishment that they exerted on that person. And so in the real criminal sentencing data, we actually found that intoxication reduced sentence length by about 4.5 years. So this is a pretty considerable reduction in judgment. But for crimes that didn't have this feasible emotional component to them, there was no effect. And in some of the studies we found that are included in the web appendix, we found that this judgment actually sometimes increased the harshness of judgment. And so what this suggests is that intoxication, there's a little bit of truth to both of those statements, that in some instances, when people are intoxicated, other people feel that their judgments don't really say much about their character. But in certain other ones, there is this belief that in vino veritas, that when we're drunk, we actually behave much more like ourselves. And so I'm really excited to be here today, and thanks for letting me share.
Thank you, Chelsea. That's fascinating. So we got into some legal stuff as well. This is really cool. So next we have Katina. Katina, you want to take it away? Thank you.
So anyways, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you both for everyone for joining today. So my name is Katina Kilo. I'm at the University of Louisville, and I'm really excited to be presenting some work that I have with Tom Kramer at UCR and Kara Bentley at Chapman University. So the title of our paper focuses on lady luck. So it's how anthropomorphized luck creates perceptions of risk sharing and drives pursuit of risky alternatives. So basically, as I say at the first point here on the slide, so what we're doing is we're examining factors that might increase consumers' likelihood of engaging in risky financial decisions, which I'm sure we all agree here has some negative implications for consumer well-being. And so when we think about financial decision-making, I think most of us would agree that in and of itself, financial decision-making engenders risk. So for example, the decision to invest in stocks, even some that might appear very promising, perhaps on Reddit boards or whatnot, such as GameStop, those stocks can generate really huge gains, and then yet in the next day or two suddenly result in devastating losses. So the consequences of risky financial decision-making They can affect people financially in terms of loss of savings and being, potentially leading to bankruptcy, can lead to emotional consequences. A lot of consumers report having financial post-traumatic stress disorder, even leading to depression. And then also personally, if you think about those stressors and the impact that it has on their lives, it can lead to increased conflict in the households, increased divorce rates, also perhaps turning to coping mechanisms that are in and of themselves maladaptive behaviors like illicit drug use or even increased alcohol use or whatnot. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to investigate what we thought was kind of an interesting antecedent to consumers' pursuit of either riskier versus safer financial alternatives. And so what we look at are consumers' propensity to anthropomorphize luck. So when you look at the prior research, research has shown that the presence of others actually influences our tendency to choose riskier versus safer options. And this has been shown a couple of times. So it's been shown with the actual presence of people, which has been coined the risky shift. Or more recently, there's been some evidence with respect to the cushion hypothesis. So not even actually the physical presence of people, but just being reminded of your support network and the community that you have and people that can kind of be there for you in case things go sideways and then you don't end up with the results that you're looking for. They found that people are actually more likely to choose riskier alternatives. So we thought, well, if the actual physical presence of people causes this, and then also, or just being reminded of this network that you have, would it be possible that an anthropomorphized entity could kind of give us the same result? And so that's what we investigate in this research. And basically what we're looking at is the extent to which you would anthropomorphize luck, and most of us think of this as lady luck, and the impact it has and our likelihood of choosing risky versus safer alternatives. And so we find that across 4 studies, that's exactly what happens, is that lady luck, or thinking about luck in human-like terms, actually gives people a feeling of security and a sense of sharing potentially some of this risk, and it causes them to choose the risky versus the safe options. So we measure their propensity, we measure their propensity to anthropomorphize luck in our first study, and then we manipulate it in some of our later studies. And our second and third studies, we use some really traditional manipulations that you find in the literature where we ask them to think about luck as a person and to describe it. But in our fourth study, we actually use a much subtler manipulation where we just include one line at the end of the decision scenario where we either say, lady luck is on your side or luck is on your side. And we found, again, that just that statement in and of itself was enough for us to actually replicate our results. And so that was actually, we're really excited about that because we think that there's a lot of public policy implications for that in terms of consumer well-being, particularly because marketers really like to use lady luck in terms of trying to increase participation in lotteries and gambling at casinos and things like that. So as you can see on my slide, there's Lady Luck Casino out in Nevada. But believe it or not, Lady Luck used to be the spokesperson for, I believe it was the Virginia State Lottery for years, like 20 years plus, and just retired. And then also scratch off tickets and so forth. Oftentimes they like to use this because it's so catchy. They use Lady Luck. And so particularly even focusing on this, with scratch off ticket games, it's been shown to be extremely popular among consumers that are lower in SES and for whom financial losses could be devastating. And so we also identified a couple of boundary conditions as well. I'm probably over my 5 minutes, so I will stop there. So thank you all for letting us share our work.
Thank you, Katina. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. Jacqueline, would you like to go? Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for your attention. I'm excited to be here. My name is Jacqueline Rifkin. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And this paper is in collaboration with Jonah Berger, who is at Wharton at University of Pennsylvania. And the project is called How Non-Consumption Can Turn Ordinary Items into Perceived Treasures. So the issue that really inspired this project, and particularly its relation with the special issue, is the issue of clutter. So clutter is a pretty pervasive problem for a lot of us American and Western consumers. And there's been a lot of research to suggest that it can be pretty harmful. So clutter can cause a lot of anxiety. It can create these feelings of being suffocated. And it can really take a toll on not only our sort of personal well-being, but also our relationships and also our work performance. And so even if your closet or pantry doesn't look exactly like this, I think a lot of us can agree that we have just too many possessions, and particularly too many possessions that we just never use. And so the research question in this paper is, why do we own so many things that we never use? And what could this teach us about clutter? And so in this project, we really focus on the role of non-consumption. So that's the decision to just not use something at some point in time. And what we find in a series of experiments is that when people decide not to use something, and in particular, when they attribute that to waiting, so I'll use this later, I'll use this another time, they start to perceive the item as more special. And so we're arguing for a self-inferential process that if I'm waiting to use this thing must be worth waiting for. It must have some additional value or specialness. And so as this possession starts to feel or seem more special, we start to treat it as if it were special, which is to say we restrict future usage of it. And so I don't mean that we stop using the possession altogether. We don't, relegate it to the shelf, never to be seen again. But what we do specifically is we try to avoid using it in ordinary occasions and instead reserve it for a more befitting kind of special or extraordinary occasion. And so what we argue in this paper and have some evidence for is that this process can actually start to kind of spiral out on itself in a process that we call a specialness spiral. So as a function of not using, passing up usage at one point in time, the item starts to feel more special, so we restrict it from usage. The more that we restrict it from usage, it starts to feel even more special, so we're restricting it from usage even more, and so on. And so what happens is that a product that initially seemed quite ordinary and might seem ordinary to another consumer or viewer is now treated as if it's this highly special, treasured possession that we are really hanging on to for some ultra special occasion that may or may not ever arise. And so tying this back to the issue of clutter, we are essentially arguing that this is one process by which clutter can accumulate, that we all own these possessions that are in truth quite ordinary, but by virtue of this one instance of non-consumption, we are just sort of viewing them as too special to part with, too special to throw away, and too special to use. So we're kind of holding out and hanging on, and by that sort of fueling this accumulation of clutter. And so at least as far as sort of implications on the personal level, I know that working on this project over the last several years has really changed the way that I view my possessions. And now whenever I notice myself sort of hanging onto a t-shirt or hanging onto a spice for a while, I try to check myself and see if I'm sort of falling prey to a specialness spiral. Thanks.
Wow, thank you very much. My life is full of specialness spirals. Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, we next have Pat and Gina. Thank you.
Well, good morning from Australia and New Zealand. My name is Patrick Van Ash, and along with Gina, we are at the University of Auckland University of Technology, and our paper's on consumer promiscuity in terms of artificial intelligence, change seeking, and pride. And so we're doing a lot of work around Amazon Go's checkout free stores, and particularly in the retail environment, what we're starting to see more is that consumers are changing the way they operate in store. They're choosing whether to communicate or not, engage or not. So if you think about our lives right now, a lot of us like to watch Netflix. So we're not going to cinemas anymore. We're not going to video stores and hiring videos and talking to the person at the front counter. Our dating, the way we date, the way we have relationships has changed. We're using Tinder and many other sites to try and connect with a partner, whether that be short, medium, or long term. And, even in the way we eat, now we don't even go to a restaurant and engage with other consumers or engage with the restaurant staff. We just order Uber Eats or any other platform that will deliver food. And so what we've been noticing is that that's really changing the way that consumers interact with companies or with firms. And we notice that provides an ability for switching. And so when we looked into that, we also noticed that consumers were avoiding intimacy. When we talked to consumers, there was no psychological fulfillment. And so they were becoming more familiar with not dealing with humans. And so they were preferring this interaction that they were driving, that they were in control of. So from that, we thought, okay, what does this link to? What are we seeing here? What are these underlying mechanisms, if you will, that are causing some of this behavior? And so what we found is that we really looked at tech addiction, sex addiction, and promiscuity. And two key factors that we find is that lack of psychological fulfillment. When we look at tech addiction, they're avoiding the experience. When it's sex addiction, it's a lack of psychological commitment. And when it's promiscuity, it's temporal discounting. One of the things that our paper is able to do, it disentangles promiscuity from sex addiction. A lot of people think that the two are linked. And interestingly enough, tech, sex, and promiscuity are not necessarily recognised as addictions per se, yet we're seeing a lot of maladaptive behaviours coming from that. And we've got a lot of future research where we're hoping that eventually these addictions will be formally recognised. So that led us to saying, well, in an environment, what kind of environment would encourage those behaviours? And we find these Amazon Go stores encourage that. The consumer is in complete control of when they enter the store. They are in control of who they talk to or not. They can grab the products they want and just exit the store. So they're able to manipulate the surroundings. They're able to manipulate their retail environment, if you will, while being in total control of just walking in, taking what they want and going. So the question really then is are retailers losing control of how consumers operate in their stores? Do we know much about dwell time? Do we know any more about basket size now, considering that consumers can just walk in, do what they want and leave? And so if our consumers are doing this and they're preferring much more of a transactional experience, then how do we emotionally connect with them? How do we re-engage with our consumers? How do we advertise to them? How do we market to them, both in-store and external, if the way that they perceive us or the way they want to engage with us is completely changing? So a great thing for us is we're doing a series of work on AI-enabled checkouts, specifically in retail. And what are those unintended consequences? Typically retailers will all be about, we're doing this for the customer to create a better experience, but are those experiences necessarily the right ones or the positive ones that we want for the consumer? And when the consumer is engaged in that, does that enhance or create more maladaptive behaviours from their side? So just quickly, we, as a conceptual framework, we looked at just trying to drive purchase intent. And one of those underlying mechanisms, obviously, in those maladaptive behaviours of tech and sex and promiscuity is really being driven by that change-seeking motivation. And so we find that as an underlying causal mechanism. Obviously, with the consumer promiscuity disentangled from sex addiction, it also acts as a boundary condition. And so what we find is people that are highly promiscuous, so sexually promiscuous, are much more attracted to shopping at Amazon Go type stores because they don't have the psychological attachment. They are in total control. They can choose to engage or not, and they can control the overall experience which one they go to, how long they're there, and what they get. Interestingly, what we find is that if we use in-store communication and increase the level of pride, or if we use marketing techniques that increase the level of pride felt by those particular highly promiscuous shoppers, we find that we're able to reduce or slow down as another boundary condition, their need or want to shop at these particular types of stores. So for us, it's very interesting research. We're finding a lot of unintended consequences, and we're continuing this journey in looking at artificial intelligence, the checkouts enabled by AI, and what that means for consumers. Thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, thanks for having me on this call. So my name is Laura Zimmermann. I'm an assistant professor at IE University in Madrid, Spain. And my paper investigates smartphone usage as a maladaptive behavior. And I also look at potential remedies to reduce screen time. So specifically for this paper, I set out to investigate smartphone screen time apps, which became popular in 2018 when Apple, for example, released their first screen time app. And I really set out to investigate, okay, do these screen time apps actually help consumers to reduce their smartphone usage? So in the first study was a longitudinal field study where I measured smartphone screen time objectively with the help of these screen time apps. And I looked at, do they help consumers to become more aware of their mobile phone usage? Do they become better calibrated, so knowing how much time they spend on their phones? And that's indeed the case. So these tracking apps, they improve digital self-awareness, but looking at actual screen time, you see in the graph on the right that there's, literally the line is pretty flat. So screen time apps are unlikely to lead to a screen time reduction. There also seems to be a negative correlation between screen time and performance at university, like several months later. So those students who spend a lot of time on the phone tended to also have a lower GPA at the end of the school year. So for the second study, I looked more into detail into, why do these screen time apps not seem to help people reduce their screen time? And actually, turns out that consumers actually tend to evaluate those interventions or those types of apps that are less effective for screen time reduction actually more positively. So they like them more, in terms of overall preference, they tend to prefer those nudges or apps that are actually less effective. So that was also the case, especially for those people who are highly dependent on their smartphones. So these guys tended to prefer purely informational tracking apps rather than the more effective apps, such as like strict blocking apps that actually stop people from spending more time on the phone because they block the access. So overall, it seems that these screen time tracking apps are actually more like tools that help consumers, symbolically achieve their goal of reducing screen time, but not actually effectively reduce usage. So as you can see in the title, people like these apps, maybe because they're actually not effective in helping them reduce their screen time. Thank you very much.
So hi everyone, my name is Sylvia Chang and I'm a PhD candidate at University of Washington. Today I'll be talking about this paper that I've been working on with Shelley and Martin, titled The Role of Standards and Discrepancy Perfectionism in Maladaptive Consumption. Our title gave away. We look at how and why does perfectionism lead to maladaptive consumption. And I personally became interested in this topic because I am a perfectionist. And I came to wonder, how does my perfectionistic tendencies influence my choice as a consumer, especially since there are often times where you don't meet the high standards you set for yourself. Now, the perfectionism literature has conceptualized the construct as multidimensional, and the two key dimensions include: one, striving towards the high standards that you set yourself, called what we call standards perfectionism. And second, focusing on the discrepancy between one's standards and actual performance, what's called discrepancy perfectionism. Now, in understanding why these two types of perfectionistic dimensions might have differential effects on maladaptive choice, we looked at the research on coping, which has found that standards and discrepancy perfectionists have different coping mechanisms in response to stressful situations like failing to meet your high standards. Specifically, whereas standards perfectionist has been found to engage in problem-focused coping by addressing the stressful situation at hand, discrepancy perfectionist has been found to engage in avoidant coping by not addressing the problem at hand. And relatedly, the emotion literature has found that feelings of guilt and shame are also associated with different types of coping, such that people who feel guilty about what they've done, because guilt elicits a motivation to fix the situation, they engage in problem-focused coping by addressing the stressful situation. And shame elicits feelings of self-inefficacy, and this leads shame-laden individuals to engage in avoidant coping as well. So combining this literature, we predict and find that discrepancy perfectionism leads to higher levels of maladaptive consumption compared to standards perfectionism. And this can be explained by feelings of guilt and shame, such that shame underlies the link between discrepancy perfectionism and maladaptive consumption, whereas feelings of guilt underlies the link between standards perfectionism and maladaptive consumption. And in our studies, we look at both measured perfectionism as a trait and also manipulated perfectionism, and maladaptive consumptions across different domains, such as various behavioral addiction scales, spanning across internet, social media, and shopping behavior, and food choices between maladaptive and adaptive options. And consistent with our predictions, we find that discrepancy perfectionism leads to higher levels of maladaptive consumption, which can be explained by shame. And standard perfectionism leads to lower levels of maladaptive consumption, which can be explained by feelings of guilt. So the key takeaway is that it's okay to be a perfectionist, but make sure to try to focus on the high standards that you set for yourself and not be too concerned about not meeting your standards. Thank you.